She had promised a dying woman she had never met that she would carry a sealed letter 2,000 miles and place it into the hands of a man whose face she had never seen. Nobody asked her to make that promise. She made it herself, on a mudflat beside the Missouri River, in the third week of April 1859, kneeling beside a woman whose name she would not learn until she read it later on a small wooden marker. Eleanor Graves, April 21, 1859. She tried. The woman had pressed the letter into Ruth Caldwell's hands with a grip that surprised her. The grip of someone who had more to give than her body had left to spend. Her eyes were still clear, which was somehow worse than if they had been clouded. She said only this: "His name is Thomas Graves. Oregon City, please." Ruth said she would. She did not know yet what those words would cost her. She was 34 years old and had buried a husband the previous November. Daniel Caldwell had gone quietly in his sleep, which people told her was a mercy, and Ruth had agreed with them out loud while privately thinking there was nothing merciful about waking in the dark to reach across a bed that had gone cold. He left her 2 children, Nora, who was 8 and solemn in the way of girls who notice more than they are given credit for, and James, who was 6 and had his father's stubborn jaw and his father's habit of chewing on things when he was thinking. He left her a farm in Ohio that the bank wanted back by spring. He left her no choices she could see from where she stood. Her sister in Ohio had offered her room, and her sister's husband had offered his opinion, which was that a woman in Ruth's situation ought to remarry quickly and practically, the way one replaced a good tool that had broken. Ruth had thanked them both and begun packing the same night. She had heard about Oregon from her neighbor, whose cousin had written a letter from the Willamette Valley describing land that cost almost nothing and air that did not carry the smell of someone else's judgment. Ruth read that letter so many times the folds began to tear. She sold what she could, packed what she could not sell, and joined a company of 31 wagons gathering at Independence, Missouri in early April of 1859. She did not know anyone. She did not know the trail. She did not know how to drive a team of oxen on soft ground, had never done it once in her life, and had spent the first 3 days of training with bruised palms and a set jaw and a string of words she had not spoken aloud since she was a girl. She arrived at the Missouri River mudflats tired and humbled and with a better understanding of oxen than she had wanted, and that was where Eleanor Graves had found her. The deepest fear Ruth carried, deeper than the fear of river crossings, deeper than the cholera that everyone whispered about in those years the way they whispered about sin, was this: that she would prove everyone right, that a woman traveling alone with 2 small children was a burden on the train and a fool to herself, and that she would arrive in Oregon City having spent everything on a dream that turned out to belong to someone else. She was thinking about exactly that fear when Eleanor Graves pressed the letter into her hands and died. The wagon master's name was Caleb Warren, and Ruth's first impression of him was that he was the kind of man who had run out of patience for people who wasted words. He was 40 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who spent more time outside than in, with dark eyes that moved constantly, checking the sky, the animals, the horizon, without ever seeming to land anywhere they wanted to stay. He had made this crossing twice before. He did not smile easily. He gave orders in the morning and rode ahead in the afternoons to check the route, and at night he sat alone by his own small fire and did not invite company. Ruth noticed him the way she noticed everything practical, with a clear eye and no sentimentality. He was the man who would or would not get them to Oregon. She intended to keep him informed and out of her way. He said almost nothing to her for the first 2 weeks. The train moved through the tall grass of eastern Nebraska, the sky so wide it seemed unkind about it, the wheel ruts of previous years still visible in the earth like old scars. At night the children slept tangled together under a quilt Ruth's mother had made, and Ruth sat outside the wagon in the dark and listened to the prairie. Not peaceful, just vast, with a sound underneath the silence that she eventually understood was the sound of absence. All the things that were not there. What Caleb finally said, when he spoke to her directly, was not what she expected. It was the morning of May the 3rd, on the south bank of the Platte River in present-day Nebraska, and the water was running higher than he liked. He had spent an hour watching the current, reading it the way someone else might read a letter, and when he came back to the wagons he went down the line giving brief instructions to each driver. When he reached Ruth, he stopped. "You drive better than most of the men," he said. "I'm putting you fourth in line at the crossing. I need the fourth wagon to go steady regardless of what the third one does. Can you do that?" Ruth looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. That was the entire conversation. He moved on. She drove fourth in line across the Platte River on the 3rd of May, 1859, the muddy brown water rising past her wheel hubs, Nora and James white-knuckled in the wagon bed behind her among the flour sacks and the iron pot and the quilt and the oilcloth-wrapped letter she had not opened. The third wagon stalled halfway across, an axle caught in a sandbar, and Ruth brought her team wide around it without losing a step, reading the current the way she had watched Caleb read it, and on the far bank she did not stop or look back until all four wheels were on dry ground. Caleb said nothing. He simply moved his horse aside to let her through. She told herself that was enough. By the time the wagon train reached Chimney Rock in Nebraska, that strange column of pale rock rising 300 feet out of the flat earth like something the land had been trying to say for 1,000 years, they were 6 weeks out of independence and the company had already buried two of its own. An elderly man named Horace Briggs had gone on the 7th day from what the others said was his heart, and a woman named Ada Forsyth had died in the night of fever on the 22nd day, leaving behind a husband and 4 children who came to meals and ate without looking at each other. Ruth understood grief as a practical problem. It had to be carried, the same way everything else was carried, because the trail did not pause for it. She helped where she could. She cooked extra for the Forsyth children when she had it to spare, and she took Nora and James to see Chimney Rock up close so they could scratch their names into the soft rock alongside the hundreds of names already carved there by the thousands who had come before and the thousands who would come after. She found a J. Caldwell already in the stone, cut deep and carefully, and she did not know if it was coincidence or not and decided it did not matter either way. The letter from Eleanor Graves she kept in the flour sack, checked every few days without fail. Not to read it, never to read it, but to make sure it had not gotten wet in a river crossing, or cracked open on its own on a hard day, or been lost in one of the 1,000 small disasters that swallowed things on this trail without ceremony. It was still sealed. The wax was dark red, the color of old roses, pressed with a small ring that left the shape of a flower, a daisy, or something near it, the kind of seal women used in those years when they still believed the things they pressed into wax would be received with the care they deserved. Ruth found herself thinking about Eleanor Graves at odd moments. The color of her hair, which had been brown with gray beginning at the temples, the grip of her hand, the specific quality of her eyes, clear, as she had noted before, and something else. Not afraid, just finished. She had said, "He tried." Not "he's a good man." Not "tell him I love him." Just those 2 words, strange and final as a door being locked. Ruth could not decide if they were the saddest words she had ever heard or the most faithful. They were 3 days west of Fort Laramie, Wyoming, deep in July, when the cholera moved through the train. It started with a boy in the 8th wagon. 9 years old, his name was Peter Oakes, and he was sick in the morning and dead by evening. His mother, Harriet, sat beside his small grave on the side of the trail and would not move for 2 hours while the company waited in the long, hot silence that settles over people when there is nothing useful left to say. Caleb let her sit. He did not check his watch. He did not send anyone to speak to her. He simply waited, and the rest of the company waited behind him. And when Harriet Oakes finally stood and walked back to her wagon without speaking, nobody said a word. Caleb rode alongside her for a full mile afterward. Said nothing. Just stayed close, his horse at a walk, one man's quiet company offered as the only thing that remained to offer. Ruth watched that from her seat and said nothing to anyone. 3 more people fell sick in the following week. 1 recovered. 2 did not. Ruth boiled every drop of water the children touched. She kept them away from the creek beds and the alkali flats that turned the grass yellow and the oxen glassy-eyed and slow. She slept 4 hours a night if she was lucky and lay awake through the rest listening for James's breathing. And somewhere in those terrible 2 weeks she stopped being afraid of dying on the trail. It became too abstract to hold, and started being afraid of something far more inconvenient. She was afraid she had made a mistake about Caleb Warren. Not the kind of mistake you make about a man who is cruel or dishonest or careless with the things entrusted to him. The other kind. The kind where you are a practical woman who has already buried one husband and does not intend to make herself foolish, and you find yourself noticing, against your will, the way a man rides alongside grief for a mile without saying a word, and you understand, with the sinking clarity of someone who knows herself too well, that this man is not the kind of man you can simply observe from a safe distance and stay safe. She did not speak of it. She barely thought it in plain words. She drove her wagon and boiled her water, and checked the letter and said her prayers, and if some of those prayers concerned matters that were not strictly spiritual in nature, she kept that between herself and God. They reached South Pass, Wyoming on the 22nd of July, 7,400 feet above sea level, the highest point on the entire trail. A broad and treeless saddle between the ranges where the air was thin and cold even in the heart of summer. The ground was bare and pale in the afternoon light, and you could see in every direction for what seemed like days. Caleb rode back along the line and said, with no ceremony, "That's the divide. Water from here runs to the Pacific." Ruth held those words for a moment. Water from here runs to the Pacific. She was past the middle of the continent. She was on the downslope of something that had, for months, felt like it had no other side. She allowed herself, for the first and only time on the crossing, to feel something close to certain she would make it. She did not know yet what was waiting for them at the Snake River. The crossing at Farewell Bend, 800 feet wide in that stretch, the current dark and fast off the Idaho mountains, was where the wagon train very nearly came apart. Not at the crossing itself, though 3 wagons did take on water and one lost a trunk of goods to the current, the lid spinning away downriver while the family that owned it watched in silence. It was what happened the night before. A man named Garrett Webb, big, loud, the kind of man who had spent his entire life making decisions for other people and calling it leadership, stood up at the evening fire and announced that the company was behind schedule and that Caleb Warren was too cautious and that they were wasting time on crossings that a more decisive man would have made 2 days ago. He said other things as well, about women traveling alone and the difficulty they created for a train, and though he did not look at Ruth directly while he said them, every person at that fire understood the direction the words were aimed. Ruth heard all of it from her side of the fire circle. She watched Caleb listen to all of it without shifting his weight. When Garrett Webb finished, Caleb stood up. There was nothing threatening in the way he rose. No clenched hands, no stepped-forward posture. He simply stood, the way a well-built wall simply stands, without needing to announce itself. "You're welcome to take your wagon ahead," he said. "The rest of us will cross in the morning, in the order I've laid out, and will arrive in Oregon City alive. That has always been the only schedule." Garrett Webb sat down. Later that night, after the camp had gone quiet and the fire had dropped to coals, Ruth was at the edge of the camp checking her oxen when she heard Caleb's boots on the dry grass behind her. She did not turn around. "He's not entirely wrong that we're behind," Caleb said. "I know," Ruth said. "We'll make it up in the valley. I believe you." A pause. The river sound filled the dark all around them, constant and enormous, and entirely indifferent to anything they might say to each other or not say. The kind of sound that makes you understand how small a conversation is. "You've been checking on Harriet Oakes," Caleb said, "every evening. Since the boy, someone should." "Yes," he said. And then, "You should sleep. So should you." He almost smiled. She heard it more than saw it, in the slight change of his breath. Then he was gone. She stood there by the oxen a few minutes longer, in the dark and the river sound, and she thought about the letter in the flour sack. She thought about Eleanor Graves, who had spent whatever was left of her strength to press it into a stranger's hands. She thought about the words on the little wooden marker she tried, and about what it might mean to arrive somewhere, 2,000 miles from where you started, and still be carrying a promise you hadn't been able to keep. Whatever Thomas Graves is going to read when he opens that letter, she thought, I hope it says exactly what she meant. I hope she didn't spend her last words being careful. The Blue Mountains of Oregon were nothing like anyone had told her they would be. People on the trail spoke of them as an obstacle, something between themselves and the valley, something to survive and get past. Nobody had told Ruth that they were beautiful. Not beautiful the way Ohio was beautiful, in the soft green way of things that have never been tested. Beautiful in the way of things that have no interest whatsoever in whether you find them beautiful or not. They climbed through pine forests thick with shadow and cold light on the first day of September, the wagons laboring on switchbacks that rose and fell through timber so dense the sky came through in small pieces, like light through a broken window. The air smelled of pine pitch and cold stone, and something green and sharp that Ruth had no name for. Nora and James walked beside the wagon to ease the load on the animals, and Ruth walked with them, and at one point James slipped on a wet root and went down hard on his palms and knees on the rocky trail. He did not cry. He stood up and looked at his hands and said, I'm all right, in exactly the voice his father had used for those words, calm and slightly annoyed at having had to say them. And Ruth felt the grief move through her the way weather moves. Sudden, total, and then gone. She put her hand on the back of his head for one moment. He kept walking. That night, camped on a ridge with the valley invisible somewhere below them in the dark, Caleb came to her fire. He did not knock or ask. He simply sat down on the other side of the flames, and Ruth poured him a cup of coffee. And for a long time neither of them said a word. The fire between them smelled of pine and sap. Somewhere below in the dark, an owl. My wife died 3 years ago, he said eventually. Not like a confession, more like a fact he had decided it was time to put down somewhere outside himself. February, fever. I'm sorry, Ruth said. We had 11 years. She was the kind of woman who knew exactly what she thought. He paused. I didn't always make it easy for her to say so. You've had time to think about that. A considerable amount of time, he said. Ruth looked at him across the fire. He looked back at her. The owl spoke again. Below them, far below, the valley was dark and invisible and waiting. What's in the letter, he said. Ruth had not told him about the letter. She had not told a single person on the train. How do you know about it? You check that flour sack every 3 days. Same time of morning, same hand going in, same way you look when it comes out. She was quiet a moment. Then she told him everything. The mudflat, Eleanor Graves, the grip, the words, the small grave marker with its 2 terrible words. She tried. Caleb listened without moving. When she finished, he said, You've carried that 2,000 miles for a stranger. I gave my word. Yes, he said, just that. Like the word deserved to be left alone for a moment. She said, I've thought about opening it 100 times. Why didn't you? She didn't ask me to read it. She asked me to deliver it. He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he stood, and before he walked back to his own camp, he said, quietly, into the dark air of the Blue Mountains, We'll find Thomas Graves. It was the first time he had included himself in anything that was hers. They came down out of the mountains on the 7th of September, and the Willamette Valley opened before them like something from a different world entirely. Green in a way that made the eyes ache after 5 months of dust and brown grass and rock. The air smelled of rain and pine and something sweet Ruth could not name and did not try to, some grass or flower specific to this place. A smell that would for the rest of her life mean arrival. Nora took her hand without saying anything. James stood on the wagon seat with one arm around the front post and just looked and looked, the way a 6-year-old looks at something he is trying to lock into his memory. They reached the Dalles at the end of the valley, where the river road would carry them the final distance. The company had lost 4 people in total. They had lost 3 wagons to various disasters, 2 teams of oxen, and more sleep than could be easily calculated. They had gained, Ruth could not say what exactly, something that did not have a common name. Oregon City was real in a way the idea of it had never been. Real streets, real noise, the sound of hammers and commerce and children running on wooden sidewalks. When Ruth stepped off the riverboat onto its docks on the 14th of September 1859, what she felt first was not triumph. It was exhaustion so complete it had become its own kind of peace. She had the letter. Caleb helped her find Thomas Graves the following morning. He knew the town well, had been here twice before, and he took her to the land office first, where a man with ink on his fingers looked up the name in the register and went quiet before he spoke. Thomas Graves had arrived in Oregon City in the spring of 1858. He had filed his claim and built a small house and died of fever in November of that same year. He was buried in the cemetery on the hill above the town. He had no family here. He had no one left. Ruth stood in the land office with the letter in her hand and said nothing at all. She and Caleb walked up to the cemetery in the warm September morning. It took them a while to find the marker. It was a modest one, wood already beginning to soften at the corners with weather. She almost walked past it. Thomas Graves, November 14, 1858. He tried. Ruth read those words and read them again. She thought about the woman who had pressed a sealed letter into her hands at the Missouri River in April of 1859. 5 months after this man in the ground had already stopped trying. Eleanor Graves had been traveling toward a husband who was already gone. She had carried her letter all those miles to a man who had died the previous fall, in a town she never reached, in a country she only just entered before she herself was buried on its mudflats. They had been heading toward each other and they had both run out of time. "Open it," Caleb said. "It's not mine. There's no one else." She looked at him. He was not pushing, he was simply standing beside her in the September light, steady as he had always been, and she thought about all the miles he had ridden alongside grief without saying a word. She thought about what he had said in the Blue Mountains. "We'll find Thomas Graves." "We?" She thought about Eleanor Graves's hands. The grip of them. She broke the wax. The letter was 3 pages, written in a careful hand that had been revised. The ink slightly different in places where sentences had been reconsidered and corrected. Ruth read it aloud, standing there between the markers on the hill. Caleb a step beside her, and her voice was steady for the first page, and then it was not. Eleanor Graves had written to tell her husband she was coming, that she had been wrong about the argument that sent him west without her, wrong about the pride that kept her from following for so long, wrong about all those years she had spent waiting for him to return instead of choosing to come to him herself. She had written that she forgave him for leaving, and she hoped he would forgive her for waiting. She had written, "I don't know what I'll find when I get there. Maybe you've made something fine. Maybe you've found someone else. Maybe you're still angry. I'm coming anyway." A woman can only wait so long before the waiting itself becomes a kind of surrender. And at the very end, in handwriting that was slightly larger than the rest, as if she had wanted to be sure it was read clearly, "I know you tried. I know I did too. I have to believe that counts for something. I am betting everything I have left that it does." Ruth folded the letter. Her hands were not quite steady. The September light lay warm across the grass, and below them the town of Oregon City went about its ordinary business with no knowledge of what had just happened on the hill. "She never made it to him," Ruth said. "No," Caleb said, and he had already been gone for months when she set out. "Yes, 2,000 miles, Ruth said. "And they never—" "No," he said, gently, like closing a book with care. She was quiet for a moment. The valley spread below them, green and enormous and entirely indifferent. Then she said, carefully, she was right about one thing, about waiting becoming its own kind of surrender. She did not look at him. She looked at the marker. A person can only do it so long before they're not really waiting anymore, before they've just stopped. Caleb said nothing, but she heard him hear it. She turned and looked at him then, fully, directly, the way she had driven the wagon across the Platte River in the 3rd week of May. No wasted movement, no hesitation. "I have 2 children," she said. "I have no money yet and no land yet. I don't know what I'm doing half the time, and the half I do know I learned on a trail I'd never walked before in my life." "I know all of that," Caleb said. "I'm telling you anyway." "I know," he said. And then, very quietly, as if saying it quietly made it less like a risk, I have an empty house. The sentence sat between them in the warm morning air. Not theatrical, not romantic exactly, just true in the way of things that have been true for a while and have finally been said out loud. Ruth looked down at Eleanor's letter in her hands. She thought about the flower-shaped wax, dark red and carefully pressed. She thought about the small grave on the Missouri mudflats and the small grave on this hill and all the miles between them that had not been enough. She folded the letter one last time, and she bent down and laid it gently in the grass beside Thomas Graves's marker. Let them have it at last. Whatever these two people had aimed themselves at and fallen short of, let them have the words at least. Let them have the letter that had tried. She straightened up, and Caleb was right there, not crowding her, just close. She could feel the warmth of him in the cool morning air the way you can feel a fire before you turn to face it. "All right," she said, just that. Just those two words, simple and complete. Below them the town went on. The valley spread beyond it, green and endless and utterly indifferent to what had just happened among the markers on the hill. Somewhere down the slope, out of sight, a child's voice rose in some ordinary small happiness. Not hers, but close. Her own children were at the bottom of the path, sitting on a fence post with their feet swinging. Nora braiding something out of grass, and James watching a dog that had no interest in him. She had carried the letter 2,000 miles. He was the one who told her to open it. And what fell out, when she finally did, was not Eleanor's grief. It was not the sad ending of a story that had closed too soon. What fell out was permission. A dying woman's understanding, pressed into wax like a seal, that a person can only wait so long, that trying counts, that the bravest thing is not to carry a sealed letter across a continent, it is to finally break it open and let yourself read what it says. She walked down the hill. Caleb walked beside her. The September light was on everything. She was exactly where she was going.